Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. This lecture we're going to talk about the concepts and components of AWS, and this is going to be a long lecture, so we're going to break it down into parts. Now, in these lectures we're going to introduce each of AWS services and tell you a little bit about what it is they do. Now, to pass the Certified Solutions Architect Associate and the Certified Developer Associate exam, you will only need to know a few of these services in depth. You don't need to know every single service on the AWS platform. That being said, it's still good to know the names of each service and what they do, because if you do get a curveball in the exam where they start talking about a particular service, at least you'll know what it is and what it does. Okay, so let's start exploring the AWS platform in a bit more detail. So underpinning all of the AWS platform, we've got the AWS Global Infrastructure, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But on top of the global infrastructure sits the following services. So we've got networking, for example, we've got compute, we've got storage, we've got databases, we've got analytics, we've got security and identity, we've got management tools, we've got application services, we've got developer tools, we've got mobile services, we've got enterprise applications, and we've got the newest service, which is Internet of Things, which is referred to as IoT. And when you actually log into the AWS Management Console, you'll see that under each of these services, you'll see individual icons, and we'll actually look at that in one of the next lectures. So let's start with the AWS Global Infrastructure. So as you can see from this map, the AWS have a number of different regions spread throughout the entire world. So we've got 5 currently in North America, including Ohio, which is about to open. We've got 3 in Europe. We've got a number of different regions throughout the Asia Pacific, and we've got 1 region in South America. The only continent that is not covered is Africa currently. And I actually met with Andy Jassy, the SVP of AWS, a few weeks ago at the Partner Summit in London, and he gave a talk about how Amazon used to deploy new regions. And essentially what they were trying to do is reduce latency for all the continents. So they would open up a new region in South America so that the South American consumers didn't have to connect into North America. They did the same for Australia, so Australia didn't have to connect into Tokyo or Singapore, etc. So they've pretty much got all their bases covered now. The only thing they are missing is Africa, and we'll just watch this space. Maybe in 2017 there'll be an African region announced. If they do it, my bets are on that it's going to be in South Africa, but we'll see. So they are opening new regions all the time, and they're adding availability zones to these regions all the time. So that raises a question: what do I mean by region, and what's an availability zone? So a region is simply a geographical area. Each region consists of 2 or more availability zones. An availability zone is simply a data center, and so you need to have this understanding as the differences between regions and availability zones going into the exam. So a region is just an area. Could be the UK, could be Germany, could be Australia. It could be one of the regions in North America. So there's like US East 1, there's US West 1, etc. So essentially it's a geographical area, and within each region you have availability zones, and they're different data centers. So you always have a minimum of 2 availability zones, but often you'll have a lot more. It really depends on the region that you're in. Also, what's an edge location? Well, edge locations are CDN endpoints for CloudFront. CDN stands for Content Distribution Network, and CloudFront is Amazon's CDN service. We will cover this in a lot more detail in the S3 section of this course, and you'll actually go in and set up your own CloudFront CDN. There are many more edge locations than there are regions. Currently, there are over 50 edge locations spread throughout the world. An edge location is different to an availability zone or a region. It's literally just an endpoint for CloudFront, so do remember the differences. Okay, so let's take a brief look at the regions as they exist today, starting with North America. So we've got 3 different regions that are generally available or publicly available to you within North America. We've got US East, which is in North Virginia. We've got US West, which is in Northern California. We've got US West, which is based in Oregon. And then we have the AWS GovCloud region. And so that's not actually available to you unless you work for the US government. And each region consists of a number of different availability zones. So if you remember, we would always have 2, but there's no sort of upper limit as to the number of availability zones. So US East has 5, whereas US West has 3, and then GovCloud has 2 currently. You also notice that there's a number of different edge locations, and these edge locations are all over the US. So we've got some in Ashburn, we've got some in Virginia, Atlanta, Chicago, Seattle, St. Louis, etc. So there are a number of different edge locations spread throughout North America. So then in South America today, we currently only have one region. This consists of 3 availability zones, and then we've got 2 edge locations. One's in Rio de Janeiro and the other one's in Sao Paulo. In Europe, Middle East, and Africa, as of today, we only have 2 regions. A third one is opening in the United Kingdom shortly, but currently it's in Ireland. We have 3 availability zones, and in Germany we have 2 availability zones. Then we have a number of edge locations spread throughout Europe. In the Asia Pacific region, we have 4 regions available. So these are in Singapore, Tokyo, Sydney, and Beijing. We have the South Korean region that's opening shortly, and then we have edge locations again spread throughout the Asia Pacific region. Okay, so let's look at the different category of services that sit on top of the global infrastructure, and then we'll look at what actual services sit behind those service categories. So we'll start with networking. Networking consists of virtual private cloud, or VPC, and this essentially is a virtual data center. So you can have multiple VPCs in your account, and you can get them to peer to each other, and we'll go through that in the networking section of the course. But I want you to think of a VPC as basically a data center that exists within your AWS account. It is completely separate and isolated set of resources from a logical perspective. So just think of it as a virtual data center, and you can have many of them in your AWS account, and they can be in different regions. We then have Direct Connect. Direct Connect is a way of connecting into the AWS environment without using an internet connection. It directly is basically running dark fiber and connects directly into AWS, and again we're going to cover that off in the networking section of the course. We then have Route 53. Now Route 53 is Amazon's DNS service. It's called Route 53 because the actual number 53 is the port that DNS sits on, and it's a joke is in Route 66 they decided to call it Route 53. And if you are interviewing for an AWS position, that can actually come up as an interview question. So there you go. Okay, so let's move on to the compute subcategory, and the most famous service that sits behind the compute category is EC2. Now this is virtualization in the cloud. Basically an EC2 instance is a virtual server. You can provision them in a couple of minutes or even a few seconds in some cases, and then you can log on and away you go. And we will cover EC2 in a lot more detail throughout this course. Next we've got EC2 Container Service. This is sometimes referred to as Amazon's ECS, and it's basically a highly scalable, fast container management service that makes it easy to run, stop, and manage Docker containers on a cluster of Amazon EC2 instances. So essentially it's EC2 but with Docker. And if you don't know what Docker is, we do have an entire course on the A Cloud Guru website around Docker and how to use it on AWS. Now EC2 Container Services does not come up in the exam as of today, however this might change, but it is good to know that essentially it's running Docker on EC2. So let's move on to Elastic Beanstalk. It's an easy to use service for deploying and scaling web applications and services that have been developed with Java, .NET, PHP, Node.js, Python, Ruby, Go, and Docker on familiar servers such as Apache, Nginx, Passenger, and IIS. Essentially, Elastic Beanstalk is designed for developers to upload their code. Amazon will then inspect this code and provision the resources underneath that you need in order to run that. So Elastic Beanstalk is sort of like AWS for beginners, and we'll have a whole section on Elastic Beanstalk later on. It is certainly covered in the exam, but from a very high level. Where you'll find Elastic Beanstalk covered in a lot of detail is the DevOps Pro exam. Now, finally, under compute, we have Lambda, and Lambda is by far the most powerful service I think that AWS offers. It's certainly the most revolutionary service, and essentially it lets you run code without provisioning or managing servers. So the aCloud Guru platform is almost entirely run off Lambda and S3. We don't actually run any kind of EC2 instances whatsoever. The great thing about Lambda is you only pay for the compute time that you use. There's no charge when your code isn't running, and that allows you to completely minimize your costs. You're paying for execution time. You don't need a server on all day, every day. You only need to pay for when your code is executed, and we'll come back to Lambda at a later point in this course. It doesn't feature very heavily in the exam at this stage. However, I think that will change throughout 2016, and we do have an entire course devoted to Lambda and how it works. Okay, so I'm going to end part 1 of the video here, and then we go on to part 2, which will cover all the other services. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.